Gray autumn rain hammered against the warped windows of Richmond County Animal Rescue, beating a frantic rhythm across the tin roof. The world outside was blurred. Streets running with water, trees stripped bare. The whole city painted in muted grays and the weary gold of dying leaves. Inside the old barn, the air was sharp with hay and something sadder. The scent of loss, of longing, of animals left behind. Horses shuffled in their stalls, some nosing the bars, some tossing their heads with restless energy. But at the farthest end, in a dim stall where the light bulb flickered like a dying star, stood a horse that almost seemed like a shadow. They called him Valor, though nobody remembered where the name had come from. Maybe it was because he never whinnied for attention, never tried to charm visitors or nip treats from a stranger's hand. Instead, he stood perfectly still, ribs pressing against thin skin, his brown coat dulled by old scars and neglect. His mane was patchy, tail thin, yet there was something in the way he held himself, some invisible dignity that made the stable hands pause when passing his stall. It was as if Valor moved through the world as a memory, present, but barely touching it. Some of the new volunteers whispered about him during their late shifts, their voices dropping as the rain grew harder. "He's waiting for someone," a young girl said, glancing nervously at his dark eyes. "Like he's holding out for a promise only he remembers." No one quite believed it, but nobody could explain why this battered thoroughbred, abandoned by all, refused to give in to the hunger, the cold, the loneliness. That evening, as the rescue's doors closed and the last car lights swept down the gravel drive, a hush settled over the barn. The horses quieted, the dogs in the kennels curled up for the night, and the night janitor moved through the shadows, sweeping straw and humming quietly to himself. When he passed Valor's stall, he slowed, feeling the weight of eyes on his back. He glanced up. Valor's head was lowered, unmoving, but then so faintly it might have been imagined. A deep, shuddering sigh escaped the horse's throat. It was a sound of such resignation and grief that the janitor, a man not easily rattled, felt something catch in his chest. He finished his rounds quickly that night, unwilling to linger in the barn's far end. As the clock ticked towards midnight, a cold wind rattled the window panes. Valor remained as he always did, silent, alone, every muscle taut with waiting. There were scars on his flanks from old injuries, faded white marks that told their own story. One of fire, maybe, or some long-ago disaster. But whatever had happened, it was clear he had not always belonged here. Sometimes, when the rain fell hard enough to drown out the world, Valor would close his eyes and, for a moment, remember a different life. Green fields, the laughter of children, a gentle hand at his neck, a man's soft voice calling his name. "Valor, come on, boy, let's ride." The memory hurt, yet it was all he had left. Morning came heavy and gray. As staff shuffled in, shaking off umbrellas and muttering about the forecast, the rescue manager, Denise, stood outside Valor's stall with a clipboard. Her face was drawn, tired from too many budget meetings, too many hard decisions. She watched the horse for a long moment, biting her lip, then made a note on her list. Later, as she poured coffee in the break room, she leaned in close to Maya, the barn coordinator. "If he's not claimed by tomorrow, we'll have to make a decision," she whispered. Her voice barely carried over the hum of the heater, but it was enough. Maya's eyes widened with alarm, but she said nothing. Decisions at the rescue always meant one thing for horses like Valor: too old, too damaged, too invisible to find a home. Back in his stall, Valor didn't lift his head when Denise walked past. He barely flinched at the sound of metal buckets clanging or the shouts of a new foal nearby. But something in the air had changed. The staff moved with extra care, some unable to meet his eyes, others leaving an extra scoop of grain in his bucket, as if it could make up for the impossible. That afternoon, as the rain finally slowed to a cold, persistent drizzle, a single visitor arrived at the rescue. The barn door creaked open, and a man stood in the doorway, soaked to the skin, clutching a battered photograph to his chest. He hesitated, uncertain, the weight of the past pulling at his shoulders. But that is a story for tomorrow. A story of hope, of reunion, and of promises kept through the darkest nights. For now, the barn held its breath, time hanging between what was and what might still be. Valor stood motionless in the gathering dusk, waiting. Somewhere deep inside, something flickered, just enough to make him hope that tomorrow would not be just another day lost to silence. The rain hadn't stopped. It clung to the city like grief, seeping through bricks and bones, pooling in the ruts of the gravel lot outside Richmond County Animal Rescue. By late afternoon, thunder rolled over the rooftops, and flashes of lightning threw wild shadows across the barn. Inside, the animals shifted nervously. A nervous border collie barked. A foal kicked the wall. But down at the farthest stall, Valor hardly moved at all, except for the slow blink of his weary eyes. The barn's main door crashed open on a gust of wind, scattering stray leaves across the entryway. A man stood framed against the grayness, soaked, his hair plastered to his forehead, rain streaking down a battered denim jacket. He hesitated, scanning the room, one hand jammed deep in his pocket, the other clutching a faded photograph that had clearly seen too many years and too many nights alone. That man was Elliot Ramsey. For a second, the world inside the barn seemed to pause, as if the air itself recognized the importance of this arrival. Elliot's boots squished on the wet floor as he stepped inside, blinking the rain from his lashes. He looked out of place here, older than his age, with lines carved deep by sorrow and sleepless nights, the faintest trace of a limp when he moved. He paused by the desk, searching for words, and found only a shaky breath. Maya, the barn coordinator, glanced up from her paperwork. She saw something in his eyes that made her set her pen down. A brittle hope, desperation masked by apology. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked, her tone cautious but not unkind. Elliot nodded, swallowing hard. I'm looking for a horse," he said. His voice was low, strained by nerves and memory. "He was my therapy horse. My best friend, really. We lost each other a few years back. House fire. I've been searching ever since. Someone told me there was a brown thoroughbred here that fit his description." He slid the photograph across the counter. Two figures caught in a summer long gone. A younger, happier Elliot, arm draped around a shining brown horse, both laughing into the sun. The picture was faded, edges curled, but the love in it was unmistakable. Maya took the photo gently, studying the details, her skepticism wavering. "What was his name?" she asked. "Valor," Elliot whispered, the word trembling as it left his lips. "But maybe he doesn't answer to that anymore. He'd have scars, on his flank, here and here." He traced the spots with a trembling finger. He went missing the night my house burned down. I always hoped he'd survived, but..." His voice broke. For a second, Elliot looked impossibly fragile, like a man held together by regret and stubborn hope. Maya saw something in him, a recognition, perhaps, of her own need to believe in second chances. She hesitated, her mind sifting through the files and faces of the barn's long-term residents. We do have a brown thoroughbred. Not many people ever ask about him. Come with me." They walked the length of the barn together, boots crunching on old straw, the hum of nervous energy following them. Horses poked their heads out to watch, their eyes curious, but Elliot hardly noticed. His focus was a razor's edge, every sense straining toward the end of the aisle, where the last stall stood in shadows. The walk felt endless, a corridor of hope and dread. Maya stopped outside Valor's stall. She motioned quietly. "He's here." Elliot stepped forward, breath catching in his throat, as he pressed his face to the bars. For a moment, time folded. He saw the old scars, the same proud tilt of the head, the faint splash of white by the hoof, but more than anything, he saw the loneliness in those eyes, an emptiness that matched his own. "That's him," Elliot managed, voice breaking, hands gripping the stall bars until his knuckles whitened. "That's really him." Valor didn't react at first. He simply stood, as if carved from the rain and shadows, unmoved by hope or heartbreak. Years of abandonment had carved deep ruts in his trust. But something in the air shifted, a tension, a pull, like an old radio catching a forgotten frequency. Maya hovered behind Elliot, her skepticism melting into quiet awe. He's never reacted to anyone before, not like this. Elliot fumbled the photograph from his pocket, holding it up so Valor could see. "It's us, buddy," he whispered, tears threatening. "I never stopped looking, not one day. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." Valor's ears twitched. His nostrils flared as he sniffed at the air, uncertain, caught between habit and hope. Outside, the thunder crashed again, rattling the walls. In that instant, something fragile seemed to pass between man and horse. Recognition, grief, the possibility of a world made right again. Maya reached for her phone, her hands shaking. "I need to let Denise know," she murmured. But Elliot didn't hear her. He was lost in the moment, anchored by the ache of years lost and the wild, trembling hope of reunion. The barn, usually bustling at this hour, had fallen utterly silent. Even the dogs stilled, as if some greater story was unfolding and none dared interrupt. Elliot pressed his forehead against the bars, whispering words only Valor could hear. "If you remember me, if you forgive me, I promise, I won't lose you again." His tears fell freely now, and in the low light, they looked almost like rain. And so, with the storm raging outside and hope flickering to life inside, the barn held its breath, waiting for what might come next. For a long moment, Elliot simply stood outside Valor's stall, his breath visible in the chilly barn air, his knuckles white where they clutched the metal bars. The sounds of the rescue, shuffling hooves, the distant rumble of thunder, faded into nothing. Time collapsed into a single fragile instant. A man and a horse, both battered by years apart, standing on the knife's edge between memory and oblivion. "Valor," Elliot murmured, his voice barely more than a ghost itself. He said the name again, gentler, as if coaxing a song from the past. The syllables caught in the space between them, settling like dust on old wounds. At first, Valor didn't react. His ears flicked, a faint shiver running down his spine, but he stayed still, his head turned away from the world as if retreating into a fortress of silence. Elliot felt his heart clench. What if he'd come too late? What if all the years of hardship had erased every last trace of their old life together? But then, slowly, as if drawn by some force stronger than memory, Valor lifted his head, his nostrils quivered, sniffing the air with cautious deliberation. He blinked, long and slow, and for the first time he met Elliot's gaze. The barn's thin autumn light caught the flecks of gold in Valor's dark eyes. There was confusion there and something like fear, a wild animal uncertainty that had nothing to do with cruelty, only with the desperate instinct to protect a wounded heart. But beneath the hesitation, something sparked, a flicker of recognition, impossible to mistake. Elliot drew a trembling breath. He dropped to his knees outside the stall, letting the old straw soak through his jeans. He reached into his jacket, pulling out the battered photograph again, holding it up for Valor to see. The image, two souls, man and horse, side by side in a sunlit field, shook in his unsteady hand. "I'm sorry," Elliot whispered, "for every night you spent alone, every day I wasn't there. I should have found you sooner. I tried. I swear I tried." Valor's ears pricked forward. His body was tense, torn between habit and hope. He stepped once toward the bars, then paused, his eyes fixed on the photograph, then on Elliot. A low, uncertain whicker escaped his throat, a sound caught between warning and longing. "Do you remember?" Elliot pressed, his voice breaking. "We used to ride by the river every Saturday. You'd let the kids braid your mane, even when you hated the ribbons. You were patient, braver than I ever was." There was a long pause. Valor's breath steamed in the cold air. Elliot's tears blurred his vision, but he held himself still, willing every ounce of his heart into the space between them. Finally, something broke loose in Valor. With a trembling snort, he stepped forward, closer than he dared in years. His nose reached through the bars, lips gently brushing the photograph in Elliot's hand. He sniffed, as if trying to pull the old scents, sun-warmed grass, salt from a man's hands, back from the brink of forgetting. A jolt ran through Elliot. He held his breath, barely daring to hope. Then, in a single wrenching moment, Valor let out a deep, choked whinny, a sound heavy with heartbreak and hope, echoing down the length of the barn like the tolling of a bell. It was a cry dredged from the depths of years lost, yet threaded with the trembling possibility of trust restored. Elliot's hand shook as he pressed it against the bars, not touching but close enough to feel the heat of Valor's breath. "You remember me, don't you, boy?" Valor's eyes glistened. For the first time, his defenses seemed to crumble. He pressed his scarred forehead softly against the metal, his body trembling not with fear, but with the effort of hope. Old habits warred with new longing. Should he believe, or protect himself from yet another loss? Maya, who had watched quietly from a respectful distance, felt her throat tighten. There was a stillness in the barn, as if every creature, horse, human, even the wary barn cats, knew something sacred was happening. Elliot whispered, "I'm here now. I promise I won't leave you again. Whatever it takes, I'll make it right." Valor let out another low sound, this one softer, almost a sigh. He shifted his weight, leaning his battered body closer to Elliot's outstretched hand. There was no sudden miracle, no cinematic leap over the stall door. Just a slow, aching surrender. A beginning. The barn's world resumed around them, but for Elliot and Valor, nothing else mattered. They existed in a private bubble, time stretched thin by memory and regret. Elliot closed his eyes, pressing his forehead to the cold bars, letting the smell of horse, straw, and rain wash over him. He thought of the fire, the way the night sky had glowed, the frantic shouts, the smoke that tore through everything he'd ever loved. For years, guilt had been his constant companion, whispering that he'd failed the only creature who'd ever believed in him unconditionally. Now, kneeling in the straw, Elliot let that guilt begin to loosen its grip. He saw it mirrored in Valor's tentative movements, in the careful way the horse leaned into the moment. Both were wounded, but both were still here, drawn together by the sheer, stubborn force of love. A barn light flickered overhead. Somewhere nearby, a colt whickered, the world ticking on. But at the heart of it all stood a man and a horse, forging the first fragile link of trust that would, with time and patience, become something unbreakable again. Night crept into the rescue, coiling around rafters and pooling in corners. Outside, the storm finally gave way to a hush, but inside the barn, the air remained heavy, thick with the scent of hay, old rain, and things unspoken. Down at the farthest stall, under the flicker of a bare bulb, Elliot pressed his palm to the cold bars, knuckles raw, forehead bent in silent prayer. He kept talking. Quiet, broken things, half memories, half apologies, spilled out of him, like water from a cracked cup. You remember how you'd stand guard when I taught those kids to ride? How you'd nudge me when you thought I was working too hard? I never got to thank you, Valor. I never got to say goodbye. His voice trembled, rising and falling in the hush. Each word was another thread stitching together the torn edges of his soul. For so long, he had rehearsed this meeting in dreams, always thinking he'd find the right thing to say, the gesture that would undo the past. But now, faced with the living, breathing horse before him, all he had were raw, imperfect words. Valor listened, ears flicking. The gaunt horse stood so close to the bars now that Elliot could feel the gentle thrum of his breath on his skin. Valor's eyes, dark and deep as old wells, locked onto Elliot's face. Something passed between them, a pulse of pain and longing so sharp even the barn's shadows seemed to draw closer. Then, with a sudden desperate lurch, Valor pressed forward, letting out a whinny so strangled and raw it cut through the barn like a cry in the wilderness. The sound wasn't loud, but it was piercing, sharp with heartbreak, hunger, hope. It was the sound of years lost, of every cold night spent waiting, of every hope quietly nursed in the dark. All at once the barn stilled. A volunteer carrying water buckets paused mid-step. Horses in their stalls lifted their heads, ears pointed, nostrils flaring. Even the old tabby cat who lived in the feed room halted, tail twitching, eyes wide. The sound seemed to stretch, to echo down the corridors and out into the night, pressing pause on everything. Elliot gasped, tears slipping down his cheeks, fingers trembling as he reached through the bars. "I never stopped searching for you," he whispered, the words thick, tangled with grief and relief. "I never gave up. On you, on us." Valor leaned in, the scars on his face catching the dim light. He pressed his forehead into Elliot's palm, hard enough to make Elliot's arm ache. For the first time in years, the horse's tail gave a slow, uncertain swish, like a pendulum knocked back into motion. The gesture was so small, so tentative, that it might have gone unnoticed. But to Elliot, it was a miracle, a promise whispered in the language of the lost. For a while, the two stayed like that. Man and horse joined at the bars, drawing strength from the fragile connection. Elliot's shoulders shook with silent sobs, his breath hitching as he tried to steady himself. Valor stayed still, eyes half closed, as if afraid any movement might break the spell. Somewhere behind them, Maya hovered, watching from a respectful distance. The barn's usual soundtrack, metal buckets clanking, hooves stomping, someone laughing in the tack room, faded into a reverent silence. Even the rain seemed to hold back, letting the world settle around this fragile moment. A deep hush fell. Time stretched. Elliot thought of all the nights he'd lain awake, haunted by the image of valor alone. Wandering fields, locked in strange stalls, forgotten by the world. Guilt had become his shadow, following him from job to job, apartment to apartment. In his worst moments, he'd nearly convinced himself that hope was a kind of cruelty, that it would have been better, easier to let go. But now, with Valor's scarred head resting in his palm, that old pain began to ease. Elliot pressed his cheek against the bars, whispering thanks and promises, the barn's chill forgotten. "Hey," Maya finally said, her voice soft but steady. "Would you like to come inside the stall?" Her eyes shone, wet with empathy. "I think he's been waiting for this as long as you have." Elliot hesitated, fearful, almost superstitious, as if any sudden movement might shatter what they'd found. But he nodded, rising to his feet. His knees cracked, his hands shook, but he managed a wavering smile. Maya unlocked the stall with a practiced twist. The gate creaked open. Valor startled, stepping back, the old wariness flaring in his eyes. But Elliot moved slowly, never breaking eye contact, his voice a steady hum. "It's just me, boy," he murmured. "Just me and you, like always." He stepped into the straw, arms open but unthreatening. Valor hesitated, muscles taut, eyes wild with uncertainty. Then, with a trembling sigh, the horse stepped forward, closing the distance, pressing his nose into Elliot's chest. A collective breath released, a ripple of relief through everyone watching, seen and unseen. The barn's animals shifted, settling into a new calm. Even Maya found herself exhaling, hope blooming in her chest. Elliot wrapped his arms around Valor's neck, burying his face in the coarse mane, letting himself cry, messy, grateful, and utterly unashamed. Valor stood perfectly still, his weight a steady anchor in the chaos of memory. And so, in the heart of the quiet barn, a wounded man and a battered horse found each other again. Not as they once were, but as they were now, broken, changed, and yet somehow whole. The night held them close, and for the first time in a long time, neither was truly alone. The barn was hushed, carrying the aftershock of reunion in every slant of light and whisper of straw. Maya had slipped away, closing the stall gate behind her with the gentlest click, leaving Elliot and Valor cocooned in their small world of hay and shadow. The other horses soon settled, picking up the threads of their own quiet lives. But in this corner, time seemed to dilate, stretching each heartbeat into something sacred and suspended. Elliot crouched low, his arms still looped loosely around Valor's neck. The horse's body was thin, bones sharp beneath the faded coat, mane like the remnants of a winter storm. Yet under Elliot's touch, Valor's breathing gradually slowed, the trembling in his flanks ebbing, as if the warmth of remembered hands could undo years of chill and neglect. For several minutes, neither moved. Outside, the rain finally faded into a hush, leaving behind the gentle plink of drops falling from gutters. The barn felt like an island, adrift in memory. Elliot rested his forehead against Valor's broad cheek, breathing in the scent of horse and hay and earth. He let his mind drift, back to a different Virginia, a different self, before fire and loss had stripped his world down to the bone. He saw sunlit mornings, dew on the pasture, the old oak at the edge of the yard. Laughter, a boy's voice, a girl's shriek, the sound of hooves thudding across open ground. Valor, then glossy and young, ambling over, ears pricked, a straw hat dangling from his teeth, having stolen it from one of the children. Elliot saw himself, grinning and shouting, trying to wrangle both kids and horse. The memory washed over him, bittersweet, a reminder of all that was lost, but also of all that had been real and good. His fingers found a familiar spot on Valor's neck, rubbing in slow circles. "You always hated thunderstorms," Elliot murmured, voice muffled in the horse's mane. "Remember the time you barreled through the gate and hid in the laundry room? Scared the life out of everyone." Valor's ear flicked, as if the memory stirred something faint and true. His head dropped lower, eyelids heavy, body sinking deeper into trust. The horse's breathing grew slow, rhythmic, a tide coming home. Elliot let himself cry, but the tears were softer now, uncoiling years of tightly held grief. He pressed his palm to Valor's chest, feeling the faint thrum of the horse's heart. "I should have come sooner," he whispered. "I should have never let go." But the guilt that had gnawed at him for years began to soften, soothed by the steady presence beside him. He realized for the first time that surviving was itself a kind of loyalty, that Valor too had endured, weathered cruelty and abandonment, but somehow never let the world grind the gentleness out of him. In that moment, Elliot understood that some things survived the fire. Not just scars, but something invisible and strong. The bond that had stitched them together as man and horse was still there, fragile but unbroken. Valor shifted, turning to nuzzle Elliot's shoulder with surprising tenderness. His breath was warm, his trust hesitant but real. He let his weight lean into Elliot, as if surrendering a little more with each passing minute. Suddenly, a distant clap of thunder echoed, a late remnant of the storm. Valor startled, flinching just slightly. Elliot reached up, cupping the horse's jaw, whispering nonsense words, the same lullabies he'd used years ago. "Easy, boy. It's just a sound. I'm right here. Nothing's going to hurt you. I promise." Slowly, Valor's panic faded. He let out a sigh, deep, shuddering, like letting go of years of braced fear. Elliot held him through it, both of them trembling, both breathing a little easier in the after. The straw rustled as Elliot finally sat, legs splayed, back against the rough boards of the stall. Valor folded his long legs and settled down beside him, stretching out on the bedding for the first time in anyone's memory. It was awkward, his movements stiff, but the horse seemed to melt, bones sagging into rust. For a while, the two simply existed. Neither past nor future mattered. Elliot spoke softly, recounting old stories, each one another step on the long road home. He remembered Valor's patience with frightened children at therapy sessions, the gentle way the horse would stand for hours while a child, sometimes unable to speak, braided his mane, whispering secrets to the animal who never judged. He told Valor how those days had saved him too, teaching him about resilience, about loving even when it hurt. His voice slowed. The barn lights dimmed as the last staff left for the night. The world outside was a hush of crickets and the occasional car, nothing to interrupt the peace they'd found. At last, Valor shifted, lowering his head onto Elliot's shoulder. The gesture was small, gentle, almost uncertain, but Elliot felt the weight of it, a complete surrender to trust. He closed his eyes, letting the moment hold him. The future was uncertain. Paperwork, obstacles, fear, those would come soon enough. But in this sliver of night, with his old friend beside him, Elliot let himself believe, truly believe, that some wounds could heal, that some things, once lost, could be found again. Time passed, unnoticed. Two souls, battered and changed by loss, sat together on a bed of straw, safe at last, in the small, silent heart of hope. Dawn crept into the barn, cold and silver, tracing every dusty beam and worn plank with shy light. The world outside was waking up. Delivery trucks grumbled down wet streets. Crows called from the trees. The city slipping back into routine. But inside the rescue, at the farthest stall, time still moved differently. Elliot woke with a start, stiff from sleeping upright, Valor's great head resting in his lap. For a moment he couldn't remember where he was. Then he saw the streaks of dried mud on his jeans, the faint lines of Valor's scars beneath his fingers, and he remembered everything. Valor stirred, blinking slowly. For the first time since anyone could recall, there was no panic in the horse's eyes, just exhaustion, and something that looked a little like hope. Elliot sat for a while, hands tangled in Valor's mane, watching dust dance in the morning light. He knew the world wouldn't wait for them forever. Soon the barn came alive. Maya arrived first, coffee in one hand, keys in the other, pausing by the stall to check on them. "You both survived the night?" she asked, voice gentle. Elliot smiled, sheepish. "I think we did better than survive." Maya glanced at Valor and grinned, a rare, honest grin. "He looks different, softer." By 8 o'clock, the rescue hummed with activity. Staff bustled in, volunteers began mucking stalls, and Denise, the manager, appeared, her face already lined with concern. She pulled Maya aside, speaking in low tones, her eyes flicking nervously to Valor's stall. Elliot overheard only fragments. "Old. Frail. Are we really sure?" He felt his pulse jump. Every happy ending had a shadow, and here it was, cold, clinical, all paperwork and policy. After a few minutes, Denise approached, her manner professional but not unkind. "Mr. Ramsey, can we talk?" Elliot stood, dusting straw from his jacket, bracing for disappointment. Denise explained the realities. "Valor is old. He's been through a lot. Adopting a horse in his condition, well, there are risks. He may not have much time left. We usually don't adopt out animals like him unless the adopter fully understands." Elliot nodded, holding her gaze. "I understand. But he's my responsibility. I lost him once. I can't do it again." His voice didn't waver. Valor, sensing the tension, stepped up beside him, leaning his weight gently into Elliot's side. Maya arrived with a stack of adoption paperwork and a clipboard. "It's a formality," she said, but Elliot's hands shook as he took the pen. Each line he signed felt like binding a wound, sealing a promise. The paperwork seemed endless. Liability waivers, care requirements, proof of ability to shelter a horse. Maya's steady presence helped. She walked him through each step, answering questions, cracking jokes to break the tension. Halfway through, the rescue's vet, Dr. Green, entered the stall for a final check. She was brisk, kind-eyed, her touch gentle as she checked Valor's teeth, legs, and the old scars along his side. "He's a fighter," she said quietly, "but he's fragile. He'll need special care. Supplements, soft hay, shelter from the cold. Some days will be better than others. You ready for that?" Elliot nodded without hesitation. "He's worth it." Dr. Green studied his face, searching for doubt, and found none. Not everyone in the barn was convinced. As Elliot led Valor out into the morning for a short walk, he heard a pair of volunteers whispering, "Why even try? That horse'll never make it. Some animals are just unadoptable." The words stung, but Maya caught his eye and shook her head. "Don't listen. Some people can't see hope unless it kicks them in the shins." The rest of the day passed in a blur. Denise handed over a worn lead rope and an envelope full of old vet records, Maya brought a battered blue halter from the lost and found, buckling it gently around Valor's head. "He deserves something that fits," she said. She slipped an apple into Elliot's hand. "For the road." Before they left, Denise stood in the doorway, arms crossed, worry etched on her face. "This is a risk," she said, "but sometimes risk is what makes life worth living." She paused, then offered her hand. "Good luck, Mr. Ramsey, and thank you." As they walked toward the loading gate, Elliot felt the eyes of the barn on him, curious, doubtful, hopeful. He stopped, turning to Maya. "Thank you for believing in us." Maya shrugged, blinking away sudden tears. "This is what hope looks like," she said, voice quiet but fierce. Loading Valor into the trailer was a test of faith for both. The horse balked at the ramp, muscles twitching, eyes wild. Elliot spoke softly, never raising his voice, coaxing Valor step by step until the horse finally climbed inside, trembling but unbroken. On the drive out of Richmond, rain pattered against the windshield, but Elliot's heart felt lighter than it had in years. Valor stood behind him, head lowered, trusting that the road, wherever it led, would not end in another goodbye. That night, in the small pasture Elliot had rented on the edge of town, he led Valor out into the wet grass beneath a sky clearing to stars. The air was sharp, the world very new. Valor sniffed the fence line, testing every boundary, but he never strayed far from Elliot's side. Elliot sank down beside the fence, watching his old friend move through moonlit shadows, the horse's silhouette frail but proud. "We're together now," he said, voice rough but certain. "I won't let you go again." Valor paused, turning to face him. In the quiet, he took a slow, careful step forward, pressing his scarred nose gently into Elliot's open palm. For the first time since the fire, man and horse stood on the same side of hope. Inside the house that night, Elliot signed the final papers, his heart steady. He knew the days ahead would not be easy. Age and hurt would test both of them, but for now, there was only the promise, spoken and silent, written and felt, that whatever time was left, they would face it together. And for the first time in years, Elliot allowed himself to dream, not of the past, but of the future, of mornings filled with soft knickers, of walking old trails, of laughter echoing across green fields. Whatever tomorrow brought, they would meet it side by side. The small pasture outside of Richmond didn't look like much on a map. Just a rough patch of fenced grass, an ancient barn hunched by a line of leafless trees, and a battered blue water trough under the wide Virginia sky. To most, it was a temporary rental, a step up from nothing but hardly a dream. But to Elliot, and now to Valor, it was the first taste of freedom, the start of something fragile and real. Their first night home was uneasy. As dusk bled into darkness, Valor paced the perimeter of the pasture, head low, tail twitching. His body, still gaunt and scarred, moved with a restless energy. Every unfamiliar sound, a distant siren, a dog barking 3 houses down, made him pause, nostrils flaring, eyes sharp with old fear. Elliot watched from the porch, heart in his throat, resisting the urge to go to him. Valor needed to test the boundaries, to see that this place was safe. Trust couldn't be forced. It had to be built, step by step. Elliot set out an old, worn blanket, faded blue with the name Valor embroidered in one corner by a trembling hand. Years ago. Next to it, he laid a battered bridle, a leftover from better days, still smelling faintly of sweat and apple-scented soap. He placed a bucket of water and a scoop of sweet feed just inside the fence, then sat quietly by the gate, legs crossed, as night insects hummed in the weeds. The moon rose, pale and clear. For a long time, Valor ignored the offerings, still circling, still searching the corners as if expecting something, someone, to leap from the shadows. Elliot's thoughts ran dark, echoing old doubts. Had he made the right choice? Could a horse so wounded ever learn to trust again? Could a man so haunted by failure ever be worthy of forgiveness? Then, at last, Valor paused near the blanket. He dropped his head, sniffing the fabric, ears flicking as if some buried memory tugged at him. He nosed the bridle, turning it over with his lips, the familiar leather sparking a flicker in his dark eyes. Finally, he looked up at Elliot, not with the wild panic of a trapped animal, but with something softer, almost questioning. Elliot didn't move, barely dared to breathe. He watched as Valor, drawn by the smallest thread of curiosity, stepped closer, finally lowering his head to nuzzle the sweet feed. The moment was small, easily missed in a bigger life, but it was everything. A first crack in the armor of old pain. That night, Elliot lay awake inside the small house, listening through the open window. He heard Valor moving restlessly at first, hooves crunching the frost-brittle grass, a whicker now and then, as the horse checked every shadow for danger. But as the hours passed, the noises changed, quieter, steadier. A long, deep sigh, the shuffle of straw as Valor finally settled on the blanket, sleep claiming him for the first time in a place that smelled like home. At dawn, Elliot stepped into the cold morning, coffee steaming in his hands. He found Valor standing quietly by the fence, watching the sunrise. For a moment, the horse looked almost regal, head high, breath clouding in the golden light, every scar a badge of endurance. They began to build routines. Each morning, Elliot would lead Valor out to the far end of the pasture, talking softly, always letting the horse set the pace. He brushed Valor's tangled mane, wincing at the old wounds, but careful never to flinch or rush. At first, Valor was skittish, tense at every unexpected touch, flinching from raised voices or sudden movements. But slowly, with every gentle gesture, a bit of trust was won. Small victories marked their days. Valor began to follow Elliot's voice, ears pricking when called. He took apples from Elliot's palm, lips warm and ticklish, teeth never snapping. One morning, as a truck backfired on the road, Valor startled, but instead of bolting, he circled back toward Elliot, seeking comfort instead of running from it. But there were setbacks too. On their third evening, a neighbor's kids set off firecrackers down the street. The sharp pops sent Valor into a frenzy. He bolted across the field, eyes rolling white, legs trembling as he hit the far fence at a gallop. Elliot's heart seized, memories of the fire clawing back. He waited, resisting the urge to chase. He called softly, voice steady, and after a long, breathless hour, Valor finally limped back, sides heaving, allowing Elliot to soothe him with slow, careful strokes. That night, as Valor slept, he whinnied in his dreams, legs twitching. Elliot stayed nearby, humming the old lullabies he remembered from childhood, tuneless, but full of quiet love. When the nightmares passed, Valor's breathing eased, and he stretched out on the grass, legs folded, eyes half closed in trust. The days grew longer. Elliot hung a calendar on the fridge marking each new step. Let me brush his legs, took apple from hand, didn't flinch at thunder. Progress was slow, sometimes invisible, but real. Every morning, Valor came a little closer. Every evening, Elliot read aloud by the porch, his voice carrying across the field as Valor grazed in the twilight. As spring threatened on the horizon, something new crept in. Hope, tentative but persistent. Elliot dared to plan for tomorrow. He researched therapy programs, called old friends in the riding community, even walked Valor to the end of the driveway to meet curious neighbors, who watched with wide eyes and whispered stories about the scarred horse with the dignified bearing. But the bond was clearest in the quiet moments. Valor's head resting against Elliot's shoulder at sunset. The horse standing guard as Elliot mended a broken fence post, a shared silence that needed no explanation. For the first time since the fire, Elliot began to believe, not just in survival, but in restoration. Valor, once a ghost on the edge of memory, was becoming real again. And in his steady company, Elliot felt his own burdens lighten, as if together they might carry each other beyond the reach of old shadows. Spring arrived on a hush of warm rain and sudden green, the whole world erupting with possibility. The pasture outside Elliot's rental turned lush almost overnight. Wildflowers scattered themselves in the high grass, and the ancient oak put out new leaves like a promise. Valor's coat grew a little glossier, his ribs softened beneath careful feeding, and his eyes lost their haunted edge. But what changed most, what neither man nor horse could have predicted, was the way their story, quietly unfolding on this forgotten edge of Richmond, began to ripple out into the world. It started, as these things so often do, with a single photograph. Maya, still checking in every few days, snapped a picture one afternoon. Elliot and Valor standing side by side in the golden hour, the battered blue halter loose in her friend's hand, the scars on Valor's side visible but no longer defining. She posted it on the rescue's modest Facebook page with a few lines. After years apart, Elliot found his best friend Valor in our far stall, old, battered, nearly invisible, but still waiting. They gave each other a second chance. She added the hashtag #HopeEndures, not thinking much would come of it. But something about the image, the gentleness in Elliot's hand, the quiet pride in Valor's bearing, struck a nerve. Within hours, the post was shared dozens, then hundreds of times. Local animal lovers commented first, then neighbors, then people from out of state. "That's the horse I always noticed at the end of the barn. So glad he has a home. Makes me want to adopt an older animal. Hope really does endure." By the end of the week, a local TV crew knocked on Elliot's door. He nearly refused. Press, attention, all of it had always felt intrusive, even cruel, but Maya convinced him. "You don't have to be a hero," she said. "Just be honest. People need stories like yours." So Elliot, still uncomfortable in front of cameras, stood in the pasture beside Valor, answering questions about loss and reunion, about patience and healing. Valor stood by him, calm and dignified, never flinching from the lens, his story written in every line of his body. The piece aired on a Tuesday night. Viewers watched as the camera lingered on the scarred horse, the quiet man, the battered blue halter. The story of hope, the kind that survives fire and years of absence, the kind that waits in dark stalls and lingers on the edge of giving up, spread through the community like a warm breeze. The next day, the rescue's phone rang off the hook. Families who had never considered adopting unadoptable animals now asked to meet the senior horses, the nervous dogs, the cats who'd given up on attention. Maya, energized and a little overwhelmed, started fielding interviews of her own. Donations poured in, bags of feed, gently used blankets, enough money for new fencing and vet bills. One retired art teacher brought her students to the barn, painting a mural above Valor's old stall, the silhouette of a proud, battered horse beneath the words, "Hope endures." Inspired by the wave of compassion, Maya arranged for Elliot and Valor to visit a local therapy center for children with disabilities. At first, Elliot was hesitant. He remembered too well how fragile Valor could be. But when they arrived, something remarkable happened. Valor, once so withdrawn, let the children approach, stood patiently as small hands stroked his scarred neck. One little girl, speechless for months after an accident, began to hum softly as she brushed Valor's mane. For an hour, the room was filled with light, sun pouring through windows, laughter mingling with the steady rhythm of hooves on the grass. That day, Elliot spoke at the rescue's spring event. He stood by the mural, Valor at his side, and tried to find words for all they'd endured. "Hope doesn't always look the way you expect," he said, voice steady despite his nerves. "Sometimes it's old, battered, a little scared. Sometimes it stands at the end of a long, dark stall, waiting for someone to remember its name." The crowd was silent for a moment. Then applause burst like a sudden rain. Strangers pressed cash into the donation jar. New volunteers signed up. And within a month, the rescue saw a record number of senior horse adoptions. Elliot found himself at the center of a gentle storm of kindness. He met people who, inspired by Valor's story, had chosen to believe in what they'd once overlooked. An aging dog, a shy cat, a lonely neighbor. He watched as the therapy center expanded its programs, its fields now echoing with the voices of children and the steady clip-clop of horses that had once been deemed too far gone. Each time he saw a nervous animal step into the arms of a new family, he felt something loosen inside, a tether snapping, a shadow lifting. Yet through it all, Elliot kept his routine simple. Each morning, he brought Valor fresh hay and a whispered greeting. Each night, he sat on the porch and watched the sun set behind the trees, Valor grazing quietly in the golden light. They were both changed, but the bond between them, tested by fire, by absence, by doubt, had become unbreakable. The mural above Valor's old stall became a gathering place. Volunteers brought coffee. New adopters paused for luck. Children pressed their hands to the painted wall. Beneath it all, the words "Hope endures" became a mantra for the whole community. And in the middle of it, sometimes lost in the swirl of attention, sometimes shy but always steady, stood Elliot and Valor. Their story was no longer just theirs. It belonged to everyone who believed that love, however battered, could find its way home. It was a testament that no matter how long you wait in the darkness, hope can find you. And with patience, you can find hope again. By the time summer bowed to fall, the grass in Elliot's pasture had faded to gold. Cicadas quieted, and leaves at the edge of the property curled red and brittle in the cooling wind. Life slowed down, taking on a steady rhythm, and both Elliot and Valor learned to move within it. Not rushing, not grasping, just being present for each day. Valor was slower now, age and hardship leaving their undeniable mark. But his eyes were clear and his days were full. Mornings spent grazing along the riverbank, afternoons dozing in the shadow of the old oak. Sometimes, when Elliot brought out a brush or an apple, Valor would nicker softly, ears pricked in gentle welcome. Their conversations were wordless, built of glances and sighs, of quiet presence, each carrying more meaning than 1,000 words. Elliot, too, changed in subtle but profound ways. For years, he'd carried guilt the way some men carried scars, hidden but heavy, always there beneath the surface. Losing his home, his horse, his purpose, it had driven him into a kind of silent exile. Now, with Valor beside him, those old wounds were healing, not because they were forgotten, but because they were finally understood. He began to keep a journal, at first just a few lines here and there. Notes about Valor's appetite, memories from therapy sessions, sketches of the river at sunrise. But as days became weeks, his words deepened. One afternoon, he wrote, "Valor taught me that love is not a flash of lightning, but the slow burn of endurance. That family is whoever waits and believes with you, even when the world moves on." The town, too, continued to feel the story's ripple. At the rescue, Maya welcomed more visitors than ever. Families looking not for the youngest, prettiest animals, but the overlooked, the shy, the ones who waited the longest. Kids who used to race past the senior horse stalls now lingered, reading the mural or whispering names to battered old geldings and mares. The phrase "hope endures" became part of local conversation, a shorthand for second chances and stubborn faith. Valor's story also found its way into the hands of the local high school's creative writing class. The students debated what made a hero, what loyalty and redemption looked like in real life. Some wrote poems about waiting, others about reunion, a few about grief and forgiveness. When Elliot was invited to visit, he listened quietly to their words and found himself moved to tears, seeing through young eyes the meaning of his own long journey. On Sundays, Elliot and Valor would walk down to the river together. The path was gentle now, the air soft with autumn. Children rode horses on the far side of the pasture, their laughter carrying on the breeze. Sometimes, one or two would run over, asking to pet Valor, to hear his story again. Elliot told it simply, truthfully, never skipping the hard parts, the nights alone, the moments when hope nearly slipped away. "He waited for me," Elliot would say, stroking Valor's neck. "That's what love is, not never getting lost, but never giving up." Maya visited on these afternoons, sometimes with news from the rescue, sometimes with nothing but a cup of coffee and a quiet smile. She noticed the difference in both man and horse, the softness in Elliot's voice, the way Valor's ears flicked forward at every sound, alert but unafraid. "You both look lighter," she said once, and Elliot laughed. "Guess that's what forgiveness does. It lets you put things down." They spoke often about the lesson beneath the story. It wasn't just reunion. It was the courage to keep searching, even when every sign told you to stop. It was the grace to forgive lost years, to recognize that love sometimes wanders but can still find its way home. Elliot wrote in his journal, "In America, hope is a kind of currency. You pass it hand to hand, sometimes in the form of a story, sometimes just a glance, sometimes the gentle act of not turning away from something broken. One person's faith can open 100 doors." He reflected on how, in this country, people came together not just because of blood, but because of shared belief. Belief in endurance, in the value of every living thing, in the idea that the invisible are only invisible until someone chooses to see them. Valor was a testament to that. A creature passed over, deemed unadoptable, invisible for so long, now a symbol for everyone who ever felt left behind. Elliot found himself opening up more, saying yes to neighbors who stopped by, sharing meals and memories with strangers who became friends. He started helping out at the rescue, speaking quietly to nervous new arrivals, telling them, "You're not alone. Someone's always looking for you, even if you can't see them yet." He watched as others, inspired by Valor, chose to take a chance on animals that needed more time, more patience, more love than most. Autumn wore on. The fields turned from green to gold. The air sharpened with the scent of wood smoke and apples. Elliot stood at the fence one evening, watching the sun drop low, painting everything in a honeyed light. He looked at Valor grazing peacefully and thought about all the waiting they had done, all the silent prayers whispered into the dark. He realized finally that hope is not passive. It is an act, a stubborn insistence that even the lost can be found, that even broken things can be made whole, that sometimes the greatest stories begin with the courage to wait, just one day longer. And so, as the world tilted toward winter, Elliot and Valor stood together on ground that felt, at last, like home. They were not what they once were, but what they had become was, in its own way, a miracle. Autumn ended with a blaze of color, maples burning red along the fence lines, the air crisp with the promise of winter. In the soft light of early morning, frost dusted the pasture, and every breath hung in the air like a small miracle. Elliot awoke before dawn, as he had every day since bringing Valor home. This morning, he found the horse standing quietly by the riverbank, watching the sun climb over the mist. Valor was slower now, his steps careful, his frame thinner than ever, but his eyes were bright, and when Elliot called, he came, steadily, faithfully, each stride a testament to endurance. Together they walked along the river, the world silent but for the crunch of hooves and boots in the grass. Elliot spoke softly, telling stories, old memories, jokes from childhood. Thanks for 1,000 silent gifts. Valor listened, ears flicking back and forth, leaning into the touch of his oldest friend. Later that morning, as the sun warmed the pasture, Elliot sensed a change in the air, a kind of stillness, as if the earth itself was listening. Valor stood beneath the old oak tree, his head lowered, eyes half closed. Elliot knelt beside him, pressing his face into the horse's neck, whispering a quiet goodbye. "Thank you for waiting for me," he said. "Thank you for teaching me how to wait." When Valor's breath grew shallow, Elliot held him close. There was no panic, no fear, only a profound sense of peace. A closing of circles, Valor passed away quietly, the morning full of birdsong, the sun streaming through leaves painted gold. Elliot did not rush the moment. He sat beside Valor for a long time, stroking his mane, letting his tears fall onto the horse's faded coat. There was sorrow, yes, a deep ache that hollowed his chest, but it was wrapped in gratitude. Gratitude for every moment they had recovered, every year redeemed. He realized then that love, real love, never truly dies. It becomes legacy, a story passed from hand to hand, a mural on a barn wall, a lesson whispered in the hush of dusk. When the time came, Elliot scattered Valor's ashes at their favorite riverbank. He let the current take them, small swirls of gray drifting into the sunlight, vanishing beneath the surface, yet carried forward into all the places they'd loved. He promised then, aloud, so the trees and the sky and the wind could hear, that he would never forget what Valor had given him: patience, forgiveness, and the courage to begin again. The rescue community mourned too. Maya painted a gold leaf into the mural above Valor's old stall, a quiet tribute. The art teacher's class added the outline of a hand, small, reaching, steady. At the next adoption event, families paused to touch the wall, to speak Valor's name, to remember the horse who had waited for years and finally been found. At the same event, a family came to adopt the last difficult horse in the barn, a mare called Star, nervous and unpredictable. The little boy, reminded of Valor's story, told his mother, "We can do this. She just needs time." Maya watched, heart full, as Star took her first step toward a new life, the echoes of hope stretching forward. As autumn gave way to winter, Elliot's house filled with gentle reminders. Cards from strangers, photos of adopted animals, letters from children who'd found comfort in Valor's story. He hung them on the fridge, a patchwork quilt of community and memory. Sometimes, when he missed Valor most, he would visit the rescue, standing beneath the mural, breathing in the scent of hay and old dreams, feeling the presence of everything that had been saved. But the greatest legacy was quieter still. Elliot found himself changed, not just healed, but opened. He spent time volunteering, sharing his story with those who thought they'd lost everything. He listened to their pain, their waiting, their long roads back. "Don't give up," he'd say. "Not on yourself, not on those you love. Hope is stubborn. Sometimes it outlasts even our fear." The lesson was clear, echoing through every new beginning. True loyalty is the heart of every bond, human or animal. Redemption is always possible, no matter how many lost years. One act of patience and faith can transform not just a life, but an entire community's sense of hope. On the coldest nights, Elliot would look up at the mural, now bright beneath winter lights. The painted Valor stood tall, head high, surrounded by wildflowers and small golden leaves, a living reminder that hope is always worth the wait. People came to see it. Old friends, new families, children who had never known the real Valor, but who carried his story in their hearts. Elliot kept writing in his journal. He wrote about forgiveness, about the courage it takes to believe in what's invisible. He wrote about the quiet way love can endure, even through storms, even after the world says enough. He wrote about patience, how it is both armor and invitation, a promise that what is meant to be found will not be lost forever. Some evenings, when the wind was soft and the stars sharp against the sky, Elliot thought he heard hoofbeats by the river, a gentle whicker in the dark. He smiled then, knowing that nothing truly good ever disappears. It becomes part of the land, the water, the stories told in barns and kitchens and beside crackling fires. So the story of Elliot and Valor lived on, not as a tale of loss, but of reunion. Not just a memory, but a promise that hope endures, that love, no matter how battered, is worth every hour of waiting, that in the end, we are defined not by what we lose, but by what we choose to keep believing in. As the first snow fell, sunlight streamed across the mural. The barn was quiet, the world at peace, and somewhere, just beyond the fence, hope waited for the next lost soul to find its way home.